This podcast is sponsored by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com.
Welcome to Permission to Speak, the video blog and podcast that loiters at the intersection of leaders who want their people to speak up, technology that facilitates connections, and results that serve our higher purpose. Now, here's your host, Kelly Vandever.
Welcome to the podcast. This is Kelly Vandever, and my special guest today is Dr. Denise Cumberland. Dr. Denise Cumberland is an assistant professor at the University of Louisville in the College of Education and Human Development. Her research interests span global leadership, governance, and entrepreneurship, and she's been published in the Journal of Workplace Learning, the Journal of Developmental Entrepreneurship, Human Resource Development International, the Organization Development Journal, Human Resources Development Review, and the Journal of Entrepreneurship Education. Prior to joining academia, Denise held several leadership roles at Yum Brands, a Fortune 200 global company in the restaurant sector. So not only has she done research on leadership, she's been in the trenches as a leader. Denise has shared with me some of the research she's done on employee voice and the impact of CEOs, which is what we'll talk about soon. But first, welcome to the podcast, Denise.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for making me sound so good.
Well, I can't help it how smart you are. It comes through.
Oh, I appreciate that. We'll see.
Okay. Well, as you know, we start with a couple of quirky questions before
Sure.
we dive into the content. So my first quirky question for you is, what is your favorite guilty pleasure television show?
Okay, well, let's see. I love television, so I started my career in marketing and way back when I was a pup, and so I watched a lot of television and bought a lot of media for our clients. So I like to claim that I became a TV junkie for my job, but then it stuck. It stuck, okay? So I enjoy reality TV shows, not all of them, but I particularly like the ones that put people in situations where we get to see their reactions. So, for example, Survivor has been one of my favorites. I never want to go on. There's no desire there, but I enjoy watching how leadership happens or doesn't happen and what happens when people overexert their desires. I also enjoy Amazing Race to see how people in a combo, like a duo, a team, react under pressure. I also enjoy Big Brother, which I know sounds kind of crazy because it's kind of a summertime guilty sin. But when you put people in this bubble, if you will, and you start wondering what happens and why do cliques form, and to me, these are all shows that are directly designed to help you understand behavior. And I actually think sometimes those behaviors are just microcosms that happen and they actually happen in the real world. So they can happen in your organization, they can happen in your personal life. And so it's kind of fun to watch. And my husband and I sit there and enjoy those guilty sins. And we talk about who's our favorite, who do we want to win and why. And we root for people. And then there's always the bad guy or the bad woman. And you're like, okay. So to me, those are fun shows.
Very cool. But no desire to go on them.
None. And I do say that Undercover Boss is a favorite of mine, but I know we're going to get there soon when we talk about my research, because that's another show that I found particularly poignant in trying to help CEOs understand what was really going on in their organization. So I think that one will come up in a few minutes, but that's another one of my favorites.
Excellent.
But no, I honestly, I'm a couch potato. Enjoy watching them. Happy to be a couch potato. No desire to put myself in a jungle or dive off a bridge or put myself in a summer-long thing with a bunch of people who are 22 to 25. I have my own children. I can deal with it.
Very funny. Very good. Very good. Thank you. And then our second quirky question is, tell us something surprising about yourself that most people don't know.
Gee, okay. So I don't know how surprising this is, but I think perhaps people are a little surprised sometimes when they realize that I was 49 or a lot of my friends thought I was crazy at 49 when I decided to sort of jump off. I kept one leg on board with the corporate side, but decided to go back for my PhD. And for 2.5 to 3 years, I had wet cloth by my bed, 2 aspirins, because I was trying to get up every morning, do my corporate job. Even though I had gone part-time, I was in a full-time PhD program. I was also teaching a class in the PhD program as well as taking courses. So I jokingly said for that sort of 2.5 to 3 year period, I just had this, every day waking up thinking, is I going to have a headache today? So cloth, 2 aspirin, ready to roll. So 49-year-old woman who is, prepared for whatever the day is going to spring on them, but ready for it with her little kit, if you will, of how to get up every morning. So I've never told anyone that one story before, so about my little kit, but I did have it ready, and it got me through. Yay! 3 years later, I walked away I loved corporate, but walked away and walked into a new career, which is in academia, and I absolutely am having a blast.
Well, that's fabulous, and thank you for sharing that deep dark secret with us. Okay, excellent, excellent. So now transitioning a little bit to something a little more serious, what is your story? What happened in your life that got you curious about this area of employee voice and CEOs listening to their employees and whatnot?
Well, I think curiosity is one of those traits I have to start with. So I'm almost curious about everything. So let me start with this. One of my problems in academia is I like to focus on one thing and then I move to another and another. And really, theoretically, in this particular profession, you should become the master of one. But I tend to enjoy lots of things. But I'll give you the example that I think brought me to this idea of voice. I was in my mid-30s and I was in charge of a new product, a healthy new product launch, actually the test. So I was in charge of new product testing for these healthy products. And we set about, it takes about 18 months to test, food products through all the processes and, getting them, making sure they're good, then putting them into test market. And we had some pretty good products. I mean, they had scored well. Everyone loved them. We were really excited. They were going to help the brand move into, this new arena of health. And then we, at that time, would turn over our test product that were successful to a launch team. So we turned over everything to the launch team. And about 8 months later, which it takes that long to try to get everything ready, the marketing, et cetera, for a national launch, we were invited to a big get-together from the CEO to try the products. So we all marched down into the conference room, 200 and some people, and we walked through and pick up the new products. And those were supposed to be the products that we had tested, right? And I'm looking down at these products, and some of them looked similar, and some of them didn't look at anything like we had tested. And I was like, what's going on? So we go to our table. Some of them didn't look very good either. And I sat down, a room full of 200 and some people, and the CEO starts bragging about the great work the test team did. He asked us all to stand up, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm supposed to stand up. I stood up, people applauded. We sat down, then the launch team stood up, everybody applauded. And he was bragging about these products, and we were all eating them. And as I was eating them, I thought, they don't taste good. Some of them don't even look good. And everybody's clapping, and we're all this is going to be the turnaround. This is going to make us move into the health arena. And I just kept thinking, should I say something? Do I raise my hand? Do I say this isn't what we tested? What do? I didn't do anything. I sat there with my mouth shut thinking, I must be stupid. I must not know new products. How did I get to be this far in this organization? I started doubting myself. And then, of course, the long story short, we rolled it out. It did not succeed. In fact, it failed very quickly. And of course, then we had to have a post-mortem, so to speak, if you will, in corporate land. We all got pulled together, the test team, the launch team, and we figured out that, we should roll out what we test, not create new products that don't get tested. And that was kind of the aha. But to me, and at the time I really didn't realize it as much, and nobody got fired. The CEO was a wonderful person, and all this worked out. But it taught me something. It taught me personally that I would never, ever not voice my opinion again, even if it was considered stupid or I did indicate it. So a couple years later, I was in charge of another team, and the product was iffy. One of those ones where it was also a smaller brand. It was designed to relaunch the brand. And I thought, it's iffy, and I feel uncomfortable. So I put together a memo, pretty detailed. I sent it to the CEO and I asked to see him. He met with me. He was a fantastic CEO. He listened to me. We spent an hour talking about the products, my concerns, his concerns, and he told me at the end, he was such a good listener. I was a really great role model, the CEO. I actually reported to him. He told me, we're in a situation where we can either take and roll the dice or we can go under. And telling me that said he had to make a strategic call and risk it. But because I had voiced my opinion, I felt, free that if anything did happen, at least I had communicated to the top, that I had taken that extra step. And after that, that sort of set in motion and behind the scenes my idea that why do people not speak up? And what is it? Are we afraid to look stupid? Do we want to look disloyal? Obviously, and we don't always speak up when we have ideas. Sometimes we just hold them back. So I think that was the germination of this interest. And then over time, like I said, it was a personal interest for me. And then I kind of got involved in this research angle because of the fact that in academia we're required to publish, so we get to do research. And I thought, what do I want to investigate? And I want to investigate why employees don't voice their concerns or their ideas. So given the freedom in this job to do what I want to do, I took the opportunity to pursue an avenue that I think is a very important one to organizations. And candidly, as you know from my background, the things that hit me were some scandals that were happening. And I became very much cognizant about how could these scandals, GM's ignition scandal or the VA scandal, how could these things happen and these leaders not know? So I thought the timing was also my own personal interest, the environment out here in terms of the organizational problems that are happening made it a very topical subject.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I definitely want to delve into that. Now, the folks listening know why I have you on the podcast, I think, because I'm so excited to, when I started reading your research and the things that you were focused on. So let's start by talking about what we alluded to a moment ago about the Undercover Boss thing. So you interviewed 13 leaders who had participated in the other Undercover Boss show. So tell folks that may not be aware of it what it's about, and then what did you set out to explore and what did you find out?
Sure. Undercover Boss is a reality television show. It actually started in the UK and then it came to the US probably around 2010. I may not get the exact year right, but 2009, 2010, we had just gone through the recession. There was lots of angst over organizations that had, that there was this environment that people were not speaking up, that CEOs were disconnected from their workforce. So Undercover Boss played into that very rightly so. They tapped into what was going on in the environment. And so actually I ended up interviewing, but did not include in the article, the executive producer, a producer, and two producers of the show who were extremely gracious to give me some time. And I learned that the show actually is very legitimate in the sense that they do surprise people. The CEOs go off without being able to tell their organization. Maybe their wife knows they're on this business trip, but it's very secretive. And so the idea is they send a CEO the CEO gives these, they actually have to ask the CEOs. Very few CEOs want to do it because it's potentially risky embarrassment. You can go into your organization and learn things that, and then the public's going to see it. And you do not, as a CEO of an organization, you have no editorial control. To know that you have no editorial control over what is shown on broadcast television, that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
So it's like a 60 Minutes thing, only you're doing it on yourself, your own organization. So you're like your own 60 Minutes team going into your organization. Of course, they have to disguise the CEOs so that the CEOs could be recognized. So they put them in these environments, and the CEO acts like a worker, and is actually told that they're either training, a fictitious story is given. I mean, we could talk the ethical issues of research, and I do understand that. But in order for them to truly get a picture of what was going inside their organization, to go in as the CEO, they may not see the real story. So it's kind of like mystery shopping. So they were mystery shopping their own organization. And what happens in the show, if anyone's ever seen it, and probably many people have because it's a highly rated show, is that the CEOs learn a lot of things. They learn about their employees. employees, they learn about themselves, they learn about their operational processes, they learn things they don't like because they're going to find out things that, wow, we do that, and we have equipment that's broken and people are having to like risk their burning themselves because we don't have the right tools and utensils, or we're putting all these new products in and asking employees without any training to execute successfully. So they are basically learning what it's like to be in the trenches. And we talk about the trenches a lot. Some of the CEOs I interviewed grew up in the organization and may recall it, but it was many years ago. And as we all know, technology changes, etc. And plus, as we move up in the world, we kind of forget what it was like. So the concept of the show is to remind these CEOs of the frontline worker and what those frontline workers go through. So with that being said, I was watching the show and one time saw someone who I knew, a CEO I knew, on it. I almost fell off my couch. I was like, oh my gosh, I know her. And I thought to myself, how I'm interested in this topic of like, why are these CEOs sort of surprised? I mean, don't they just visit? I mean, I worked for a lot of big companies and the CEOs did eat lunch with people. And I'm not saying they were perfect, but they certainly stayed connected. What happens when they don't stay connected? So I started thinking maybe there's been research on this because that's what we do in academia. We look for other research. And I only found really one article by a woman by the name of Kimberly Edelman who looked at healthcare organizations. And there she had looked at these CEOs in these top healthcare organizations and how they stay connected to employees. All of the other research was very practitioner-oriented. You should do this, but nothing scientific. And so I was thinking about how could I go and discover this and understand it better as a researcher. And I thought, well, television reality shows, is it a possibility that I could interview people who did this for a TV show? Would it be legitimate? So I started doing some research on that and found out many scholars actually think most of us learn a lot from TV. I mean, let's face it, we're not all reading these scholarly journals and we're not always reading even practitioner books. We watch television and we learn from what we see. So I said, I can make the argument that this has scientific merit because mass media is a vehicle, and other scholars had used these mass media reality TV shows. So I then just started what I call the process of asking people to talk to me. So, and these CEOs, I started with the person I knew, and then she introduced me to some other people who had been on the show. And then one of the CEOs said, I want to introduce you to the executive producer. And then another CEO said, I'm going to send an email to 5 of my other colleagues. They almost became a little group. And the next thing I know, I had more CEOs than I knew what to do with in terms of, and I was always shocked by how willing they were to be interviewed. And I asked them some really tough questions about, not only what did you learn and why did you do this? And I was surprised by their candor. So that's kind of how it all pulled together. And then ultimately, after all the interviews, my colleague and I, Dr. Mira Alagaraja, she and I sat down, transcribed, and then analyzed what we were told to see what could we learn from those experiences those folks had. And that's really qualitative research at its best.
So, did you have expectations going in about what you would find, and then what kinds of things were interesting and or even surprising about the discussions you had with those CEOs?
Well, because it was a television show, of course, we watched a lot of the shows. Unfortunately, everything nowadays is so accessible. You don't even have to watch it in real time. You can watch it through the internet, or you can watch it, DVR it, and pretty soon my DVR was filled. And my husband's like, are we going to keep these 22 episodes of Undercover Boss on our television for the next 20 years? And I was like, yes, we are, okay? So I would DVR them. I'd watch them on the internet. So I think from our learning experience, we kind of anticipated that, if you go in with some knowledge, would be that the CEOs were going to have some surprises. There were going to be things that they did not expect. So what we really wanted to learn was, what did they learn from this? And I also wanted to know why they did it. Would you do it again? And did they think being undercover was necessary? Like, could they have just gone in as the CEO and heard and learned the same things? And then my other question, which is one you wouldn't get any of that actually from the show, but the other question was, watching the show, The other question I had is, so what did you do with this information, right?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you can learn things and knowledge, but what actions were taken? So we asked them, so with that knowledge came, and your experience, and would you do it again? And what changes did you make, if any, in your organization? So those were some of the key things we went set out to learn.
And so, what were some of the findings that were most prevalent across all those folks you interviewed?
Sure. Well, it was interesting. Obviously the CEOs, as the show became more popular, they knew what they might be in for. Like, okay, risk, right? So they talked to me a little bit about their hesitancy. One CEO told me that he almost called them the day of and canceled. He said, I was actually contemplating canceling, and they thought, no, I have to do this. I need to understand what's going on in my culture. What's it really like down there? Other CEOs, and again, they're not going to be shy. They said, this was a great marketing in terms of, many of them said one of the reasons was, hey, it would be high visibility. Marketing, it's, a CBS television show, it would be visibility. But many of them also complimented that. In fact, all but one said the other reason was, I really wanted to know what employees thought and what they were thinking. So there was really this their desire to learn about their own organization. That was interesting. But then the findings about what they experienced, I said, so what did you learn? To all of them were like, and even the producers would say, these CEOs learn how hard those jobs are and how demanding those jobs are, and what it's really like to, obviously not have access to bathrooms when you need bathrooms, or to put up with people screaming insults at you. Sometimes customers are not particularly friendly, or managers screaming at you. They learned that it takes a lot of time sometimes to make something when you weren't even trained how to do it. So they learned about things that were hardships employees had on a personal level, about being invited over to other employees' houses for lunch or dinner, or going out to lunch and learning about that employee's story. And some of the CEOs talked about meeting people and hearing those employee stories, and then connecting with the employee based on their own story. I mean, there were times when I would read through the transcripts and I'd be like almost emotionally crying, because what these CEOs learned was the human side of the organization, and not just the financial side. So you can see I kind of get choked up.
Yeah. That's powerful. That's powerful.
So, and then the good news too, I think in almost every case, what was interesting, and you saw this in the actual paper and the manuscript in the paper that was published, is that changes were made. So organizations, the CEOs had the power to fix things. Now, it's interesting when CEOs have the power to fix things, some of them, the changes they made would be from anything setting up an employee fund for anybody who has a hardship, sort of a hardship fund. Then they would also set up things like new training programs, right? That was a biggie. We're going to train people because we're not, we can't expect people to go out and execute if we don't have them trained correctly. Then other situations would be they had more of an open door policy or more communication. But what I found interesting is we like to solve problems. This is a human nature. So we go after the easy things first. And the easy things first are fixing the equipment, are training, right? So we often approach things from that standpoint. What I think sometimes gets missed is how and why these things happen to start with, which means cultures that have to be open and transparent. Employees have to have the confidence that they're able to tell their supervisor something, and their supervisor is going to communicate it up. And the other aha to me is that CEOs need to continue to stay connected vertically and not just horizontally with their top leadership team or their next group down, the directors. They really need to be working their understanding all the way through the organization, this idea of relationships from top to bottom, not just across the board, horizontal.
But I noticed in your research that there were only, I think it was either 3 or 4 companies that, I think it was 4, that put processes in place to continue to seek employee input.
Exactly.
What do you make of that?
I think it goes back to that comment I made a few minutes ago about how we want to fix the easy, we want to fix things. And fixing things means we go after what I call the areas that are most obvious to be easily fixed, right? So it's easy to fix certain things, broken equipment, training processes, newsletters. But what is more difficult, takes more time and takes more attention, is this idea of how do I, as a CEO, continue to put myself in environments where I'm connected to employees? How do I, as a CEO, know that the real voices of employees are going upwards, sort of this upward flow of information? That's a challenge. And organizations still struggle with what structures, what formal structures, what informal structures can we put in there. That takes a lot of time and attention and nurturing, and that's, I think, something that CEOs and most of us, we want fast answers and get things fixed, and then we'll worry about that the next time things fall apart. And I think that's where organizations go through these cycles of, well, we're going to pay attention to it. It was even my own example of my personal experience. Well, we have a new motto. We are going to test and launch what we test, launch what we test. They totally missed the concept that people probably beyond me, I was probably not the only person who had taste buds who said those products were not good. Later on, I learned a lot of people thought they weren't good. A lot of us were sitting in there clapping, but not really voicing. So nobody even captured that miss. And that's why, because the easy answer was, well, we'll just always launch what we test.
Right. So is that what you think has happened with a lot of these corporate scandals that we've been reading about? Do you think is people are afraid to speak up or doubt themselves?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's been a lot of academic scholars who have focused on voice. And so I've been invested deeply in their literature and learned from them. So my colleagues out there, Elizabeth Morrison out of New York, she's one of my colleagues who I value her work. And there's other colleagues as well, like I mentioned, Kimberly Edelman. And there's multitudes of these wonderful scholars that I could just rattle off name after name who have investigated voice to find out what, in organizations, what are the things that are needed before people feel comfortable to speak up. So some of the things they've found, researchers have found, would be things like supervisors who are open to new ideas. So a supervisor who is open to new ideas versus one who just is like, get your job done, very transactional, you're more likely to speak up. Another one would be employees' trust. So if I bring you information, you're not going to hold it against me if I say something's broken, or we're not going to hit that deadline unless you're willing to take a high risk on it failing after it goes out. Or so it's called missing those deadlines and being able to say, because otherwise what happens is we hit the deadlines, but we put out faulty services or faulty materials or faulty products. So what we call safety. Safety, I won't be fired. Ethical leadership. Leaders who, again, goes back to that ethical and trust. You have to believe you can speak up and that there won't be any ramifications. So those are some top ones. The trust, the transparency, supervisors. So a lot of it, as you can imagine, and you talked about earlier, is leadership. And it's how leadership manifests itself. And again, employees back in the 1970s, a famous scholar, Albert Hirschman, wrote a book on exit, voice, and loyalty. So when people are unhappy, they have options. They can leave, they can speak up. And sometimes they sit back and they're loyal and they just wait and see, well, how long can I put up with this before I speak up or I leave? So kind of that loyalty factor plays in. And people don't always exit by walking out the door. Sometimes people exit mentally. So I'll get my job done. I'll do it. I'll give it to you. I leave. I go home to my family and my life. And so you're getting me, but not my investment, not my true deep love of your organizational commitment. So exit doesn't just mean walking out the door. You can exit mentally as well in terms of your commitment. I guess I should say more of a commitment to the organization. Yeah. So, I mean, it's been around forever, since 1970. We've been talking about this. How do we inspire organizations to hold themselves up as mantras of places that people feel comfortable speaking up?
Well, and culture was mentioned by 10 of the 13 CEOs and that aspect. So when when we are talking about the undercover boss and kind of this idea, this culture idea, you said that, part of the premise of the show is that they go undercover so they can get the unvarnished truth, right? Mm-hmm. So have you seen organizations where they have a culture that it is okay, people know he's the CEO or she's the CEO, and they still feel comfortable saying, this product doesn't taste good, or it's not what we tested, or
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy to say this happens more frequently. It doesn't always happen, but smaller companies but when you read Fortune 500, or the top 25 or the top 50 small companies, I did an analysis last year of the top 50 small companies, and I think an overwhelmingly majority of them, and I don't think it, I know, there was always this ability of the CEO to stay connected to their employees. Either it was walking around on Friday afternoon and sitting down with people, or having lunches with employees, or open door policies, sort of informal mechanisms. So in smaller companies, those informal mechanisms actually work well, but it was really the desire by the CEO or the leader to listen, to hear. And I actually read this really interesting article recently. I wish I could remember who wrote it. I would ever throw a shout out to them, but it was about influence. And we talk about leaders being able to influence others. And good leadership is about our ability to influence others. And this was taking an idea, the opposite idea. Good leadership is letting others influence you. So listening. So if you are open and you're a really good leader, you want others to influence your decisions. You want to listen to whether it's the person who was on the front line tell you about the equipment that's broken or not working as effectively, but it's going to cost a lot to fix. You want to know, and you want to be influenced by their thoughts, their opinions, and what is mattering to them at the moment. So I think influence is both ways. It's not just my ability to influence someone as a leader, but their ability to influence me. So I thought that was a really interesting new insight about leadership.
That's nice. Yeah, and I know in surveys about when people ask, tell me about your best boss or your best leader, listening always comes up on that
Absolutely.
list every time.
Absolutely. And then I think we also sometimes the issue, and I do think in organizations they can make this work. The CEOs of those healthcare organizations had it took time, but they had regular lunch meetings, and everybody has to eat. So have lunchtime meetings with a group of employees once a month. And again, there is a power differential, and absolutely we could say, well, the CEO sits at the breakfast table, but if we all sit there and only, eat and tell them what we think they want to hear, that's not true. It takes time for that CEO to know they have to build the comfort level with the employees so they don't feel their power is holding people back in terms of being honest or saying what they think. So it takes the CEO who is really committed, or any leader, I'm just using the CEO, to really make sure employees feel comfortable talking to them about all issues. And so I think HR, human resources, is going to need to really help train both sides. And when I say both sides, employees, we sometimes think, well, I told them about it and they didn't do anything.
Right.
Yet just because you tell someone about it doesn't mean that they can, like the CEO, I told them about the iffy product. We had a choice. They rolled that product out, right? But I told them about it, and they had followed my advice. But the reality was he explained why they were not going to be able to do what I thought, which would be hold back on that launch. And I think if we tell people your voice is heard and voices matter, but we always have to couch and train people to accept the fact that sometimes it's not going to go our way. We're not going to, whatever we think, we may not have the whole picture. Mm-hmm. So I think from that standpoint, we have to, as employees, understand that, we don't see the whole picture. We see our portion of the picture. Right. And so but as long as I voice my portion of the picture to the CEO, I have to say, hey, they have the full picture, so that they should be able to use other pieces of data to make those decisions. And if they choose to move forward, even after I've expressed worry, then I have, it depends on how bad was I worried. If it was going to hurt people, maybe I feel bad enough that I do a, whistleblowing. But if it was more about the lines of, I don't think it's going to impact the bottom line as effectively, right? Then I think I sit there and I say, well, I didn't have the full picture. So I can't expect them to take my advice on everything. They have a better insight about the whole thing.
Right. Very good. Very good. I think that's good for us all to hear too, as in leadership roles, that we have to coach employees too. And I used to do that. I used to say, I want to hear the bad things that I may not really, like to hear, but I'd rather hear them. Or when I'm making a decision, I want your input. I may go a different direction, and if I can, I'll explain why. But
Exactly.
but yeah, we've got to get that open environment to begin with. To begin with, right?
And I do think it can happen. I think it continually has to happen, and I think we always expect it going to stay the same way. No, culture is always shifting, and new people come in, and environmental circumstances happen, and sometimes we move into what I call organizations move from being very successful to, or they might go into a period of where they're in major reorganization and things change, and that's the hard part. So there's this always constant shift, and it means constant attention to these topics, and we'd like to get things settled, and then we like to move on. The dilemma with culture is it's always going to be there, and you have to constantly tap in to make sure it's the culture you want.
Absolutely. Very well said. Very well said. Okay. In a different study that you shared with me, you looked at the openness of the supervisor and how it relates to employee satisfaction and employee engagement and employee voice. Could you share with the audience about that study and what you found?
Sure. So this was done with smaller companies, small and medium-sized organizations, and more of what I'll call a mid-level kind of director, so a leader. And we were curious if in these smaller because like I talked to, it's kind of like with research. When you look at an environment, you have to think, okay, I'm looking at it in this context. That's why research never ends, because we're always looking at it in a certain context. So I had wanted to look at a context that wasn't a large organization, but more of that small and medium-sized organization, and that mid-level person, manager or director who reports to a fairly senior person. And what was their psychological safety? Was that still important? We had been proven before that this idea of safety was important in other studies. So is it important in this context that and if it is important for people to feel safe before they voice, is there anything in between that has to happen as well? So is there intervening thing that can facilitate it, right? So, or is it just, hey, I feel safe, so I'm going to speak up? Or is there something else part of the process, some other element? So my colleagues and I looked at, and one of my colleagues is very famous on the concept of engagement. So we were really curious if employee engagement impacted this idea of, if I'm engaged and I feel safe, will I speak up? There had been research that had said engagement occurs after. So if I'm able to voice, then I feel engaged. So it's the old chicken and the egg. What comes first, And so I think in research, we're always trying to discover, and this may be the ever-ending elusiveness. Maybe in some situations, something comes first, and in other situations with frontline workers, maybe it happens after the fact. But in this study, we found that, again, middle management across all these different organizations, it wasn't just one organization, it was many organizations. We found that safety, this idea of feeling safe to speak up, yes, definitely important for voice, but that it occurred, there was this concept of, if I'm engaged, I'm motivated to speak up. So in other words, people who felt safe but weren't engaged, why the heck would I care? I don't need to speak up because everything's fine by me. I'm not gonna rock any boats, or I'm not gonna throw any ideas out there. I feel safe, but it didn't really matter. So for this particular group of employees who are that mid-level manager in these small and medium-sized organizations, the safety component was facilitated, and they spoke up more when they themselves were engaged in the organization. So it wasn't an outcome, it was a predecessor, it came first. Yeah. So I think in other studies, engagement has been shown to be an outcome. So when employees voice, they're more engaged. And that's very possible in different organizations where you're looking either at one organization or you're looking at different levels of workers. But we were pretty excited about that because it proved again that an engaged employee is a motivated employee. And motivated employees, what? They take action. Right. And speaking up is what? An action. It's kind of this extra thing I would have to do. I bring to the party. I bring my desire to share information, good or bad, right? And then there's a lot of studies that pull apart this idea of, well, I speak up, but only when I've got something good to say. What about when there's a problem in the organization? We have to have people who are willing to speak up and point out the issues as well.
Right. Very good. Very good. Excellent. Okay. So, based on the research that you've done and this idea that engagement is an antecedent to voice rather than an outcome, what kind of recommendations would you have for leaders? What can we do to with this knowledge to be more effective and to be better leaders?
Okay, well, I think it starts with the organization, and I think the leaders in the organization, and I think it always starts with the person who can have the impact on being able to make things happen. So senior leadership really has to own this idea of we want this culture to be X. Open, transparent, voices matter. So a lot of organizations have their pithy little statements, and pithy, I mean things like I worked for one once that was really good. It was, how did it work? Let's see. Oh, promise a lot, deliver more. So we were a client-based organization. Promise a lot, deliver more. Another one was, think like an owner. Okay. So, and that we always have these wonderful pithy statements. Mine would be, every voice matters. Every voice is going to be heard. Your opinions count. Something along those lines. So I would first want to have this idea that superseded globally, sort of this culture of transparency and openness. We need to have everyone know that their voices matter. So with that knowledge, then you set up structures, formal structures and informal structures that allow employees to have that input. So from a formal structure, HR structures, they can be set in place, and they can be, obviously, employee suggestion boxes or internet places where people can go in and put their ideas, some of those, typical ones, departmental meetings, 360s, leadership who, obviously has open door, informal. So informal policies would be that open door policy. But I think from the standpoint, both types are needed. Formal processes that HR takes account for, and then informal processes that occur. And the informal are actually the ones that are probably harder because they really require a commitment of time. So much like the CEOs of those healthcare organizations, it's accessibility. It's making sure I don't wait for employees to come to me, right? I'm the CEO. I go out to the employees. So I sit down at the cafeteria and I talk to people. And we read about this a lot in the practitioner literature about CEOs who go on rides, who go out into the, either it's rides where they might be riding with the bus drivers, or they might be putting themselves in the same environment to understand what's going on, or having breakfast, with employees, or inviting them in, but not doing it once a year. That's certainly not going to create a culture. It's having a regular input. And CEOs who do that type of regular Friday, or even every leader of a team, every Friday afternoon or whatever day it makes sense, we have a get together to talk about, well, what went right this week? Okay. What could we have optimized this week? So never being satisfied with what went right. What could we optimize? And we have to come up with something. So don't give us this, quiet. If there are no questions, then that means you disagree with me, right? So I tell my classes all the time, no questions is an insult. You have to have questions, because if you don't, then I'm insulted. Because to me, curiosity means you want to know more, or you're going to pose different ideas. So I think we have to go out and encourage people to speak up and let them know, even among senior leaders, by not asking questions, that means you disagree. So then tell me why you disagree. Put people on the spot. So there's a lot of informal training that could occur with senior leaders to help them, force them actually to start looking at things from a different frame of reference. And I think we only want to see the world sometimes from our frame of reference. And that's harder to go, oh, I want to go over here and look at how this is going to impact employees or mid-level managers who have to communicate this change to our structures.
Right, absolutely.
I wish I had all the answers. I honestly don't. But I will tell you, there's a lot of smart people out there, and I say we just borrow all the good ideas from all those smart people and try them out. And what works sticks, and if it doesn't work, we try something else.
And does the research support that the more we get people to speak up and engage, the better business results we get?
Absolutely. And I think we get, we always become appalled when we read those stories about organizations where customers are, fake accounts are being set up. That was the most recent one, right? We have fake bank accounts, and we're sitting there, and that CEO's gone, isn't he? But what happens is we can be accomplish this, but the reality is we have to be open to the realization that we have to be willing to take criticism. And so I do think it can happen. I do think it requires a lot of guts. And at times we're going to see things we don't like. All of us have probably, or many of us have taken 360s and gotten feedback. I, in my 30s, had one, and it was like, wow, you were very micromanager. And it was huge for me because it taught me that I have one way to get there, and I think my way is right, but somebody else may have another way to get there, and that's equally right. So being willing to listen to that taught me so much because it meant that I was able to say, hey, my way works for me, but somebody else may have a better way that works for them. And unless there's an overarching need for me to be safe, hey, go out and do it your way and come back and tell me how that went because I want to learn from you. So learning from other people, different ways of doing things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, just checking my list here. One thing we haven't talked about, you had some other research where you talked about this idea of social capital.
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit about what that research is and the implications for leaders?
Absolutely. Well, it's sort of a spiral with research. It just keeps taking you down into this stuff more and more. And so as I started thinking about these vertical interactions I was talking about that I thought CEOs needed to have when their organization, so vertical rather than just horizontal. And then I started looking at that small business organizations and this idea of safety and engagement. It sort of led me into this idea, this theory of social capital, which is really about, and we all use it, we all have it, this idea that it's a resource, that it comes from not just the people I know, but being able to access what they know. So when I was in corporate, and I used to jokingly say, I like to talk and meet people, and that's why I'm a qualitative researcher. I like to listen to people and know what they know and learn from them. So connections and being able to find out things. And you're more successful when you actually have a lot of diverse connections. So if you don't just know people in your little group, right, you want to know people outside of that group. So I wanted to know people in the food innovation teams or the legal team or the HR team or the whatever team, right? You want to know people in different parts of your organization, and you want to have access to their knowledge. So social capital is this idea that you build these relationships with people, and you now have this all of their knowledge because you can tap into what they know. So it's kind of like a resource. So the idea here was that I'm proposing with some colleagues that if CEOs have strong networks and weak networks. And weak isn't a bad thing. Weak means that they are in touch with people further out. So not just the people they come into contact daily, but they can actually go down to the mailroom or to the front line and speak to employees, and they know them by the name, or they can relate to them, they can talk to them and have a conversation. So it's that ability for that leader, and actually Edgar Schein wrote a wonderful book called Humble Inquiry. And Humble Inquiry is about that leader who takes and asks questions. And so they don't just walk into a room and want to share what they know. They want to learn from the people that are in the room. And that means people in the organization. So to me, this is all related. It's about leaders who are curious, who want to have relationships and access to knowledge from many different areas. So this idea of social capital is that if human resources, the HR team, could figure out ways to set up formal mechanisms, and they have, many organizations do this, to create environments where people are accessing each other in different environments, different functions. So, there's opportunities to meet people from different avenues or different teams. That's why teams work, because we're getting together people from different groups. So HR could do the formal portion of these social capital structures where we get to know each other and mingle and meet and share insights, whether it's the gym on campus or it's rolling conversations where you get to share information about your family, or you meet people, or you expose, here's my family, and you kind of get to learn from one another. Then you have the CEO who's really trying to move not horizontally, but vertically into the organization. And that's that CEO who wants to be connected and have a relationship with the different functions, not just their senior leadership team. And that means being accessible and wanting to walk into somebody's office, sit down, and ask them questions about their job. Now, it's a little intimidating at first, and you have to be careful because CEOs will say, I tried that, and I scared people, and they told me not to come in. And I'm thinking, there is time and some effort. So you kind of have to, but I've worked for wonderful bosses who would come in and sit down in my office and just listen to what was going on in my world. And I just came to huge respect for them. And I think they are the best leaders because they made you feel connected to the organization, and they had this ability to make you want to share with them what you knew. They had social capital.
Did those leaders, did they themselves open up? Were they fairly open people?
Absolutely. And again, I think it's their willingness to relate. So if I related a personal story about what was going on in my life, they would comment on their life. And so you got to know them as human beings, not just as bosses, so to speak, but sort of that relationship, because relationships are about trust. And it's not just always business. It's about understanding people's family or understanding what's going on in their world, looking at pictures on their desk and asking about them. So it's not just knowing me as an employee who is, functionally good, but also knowing that I have kids or that I have dogs, or being able to relate to me that we're both, humongous X fans, whatever that fandom would be. But I call it's the human part of wanting to go into the office, being part of a group that you have, somebody actually knows who I am, knows about my family, knows I like X. And so, yes, they were very much like that.
I think that emotional side is underestimated a lot.
Absolutely.
By leaders. So
agreed. And it does take time. Mm-hmm. And it's not and everyone, we always jokingly say that not every leader is going to be good at everything. And that is absolutely true. In that case, I would always argue that, okay, you can't be what you're not. So introverts are going to, say, but I'm just not good. I look awkward. Then I say, you can find ways that work for you. This is where you work with people who can help you create what will make you comfortable and the other person comfortable. And so I think it's just too easy to give up when we say, well, that's not my personality. I say, well, let's try to find something that works for your personality and still allows you to connect with employees and get to know people, because as we know, CEOs need to be communication people. They need to have those skills.
Yeah. I would think an introvert could write some things and share that. That would
Beautiful.
Be
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's another vehicle for transparency, and openness. Absolutely. And being able to I've read about CEOs who, are email. You have my email, and I'm going to respond to them. So they take a personal interest in getting back to people when they get an email from an employee.
Wow, that's fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
That's fabulous. Well, in a moment, I'm going to ask you if you have any additional advice or tips that you'd like to share with our audience based on your research and your personal experiences. But before I do ask that, what have been one or two pleasant surprises along this journey of leadership and the research that you've been doing?
Well, I think I'm always, and I don't know, surprised, but that's a good word. Let's see. I would say I'm always surprised by the fact that if you just take and you really just watch people, that you learn so much from them. And so to me, I always say, I'm obviously now I'm in academia, so I'm a big believer in research and reading. And, I dive into all of this stuff with, tenacity. I want to understand everything. But sometimes we can just learn by watching people. And so, like I said, I've been very fortunate to have great people who I watched and saw their skill set, and I adapted I was like, okay, I like that about them. So I think we have to, the surprise to me is so much that the way we mold ourselves comes from probably a lot of different avenues. And so I think of myself as a culmination of all the great leaders who I worked for, who gave me things that I wanted to adapt and put into my arsenal. And then things I saw that I said, okay, that's a trait that I don't want, that, so I'm going to try real hard not to do that. So I would say the surprise for me is that learning comes from not just the books, which I'm a big fan of, and the journal articles, but it comes from the real world experience of being able to look to people and borrow from their repertoire of skills that we think are good ones to have.
Absolutely. And we mentioned before when we talked, I thought your students are lucky because they have not just the research, but that real world experience that you can share with them to help them as they learn.
Well, I like to say they help me too because I always walk away smarter after I teach a class because they bring so much to the party, and we always have what I call it a party. I'm like, we're going to share knowledge, and that's what learning is all about. It's just a matter of my knowledge is sharing with you, your knowledge is sharing back with me, and we all learn from one another. It's just a big knowledge transfer exchange of information, and that's really what I think makes life fun.
I agree wholeheartedly. Well, before we sign off, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you think might be good for folks to hear?
Well, I think, you linked it back at the beginning. I would say the other thing is always the curiosity factor. I think learning means we're curious people, and whether we're in business and trying to market products or services, the idea of, well, what could make this better? Never being satisfied, being curious. But when I say never being satisfied, it doesn't mean we just sit there and set new sales goals of, X%. It's more about curious of, are we doing it the right way? Are we, and I would say the other thing is continue to ask the questions of, don't just try to a solution with a band-aid, which is the obvious solution. Dig deep. Continually look for the areas that might be hampering your business or your organizational growth. It's about uncovering, picking up the rug and looking underneath it and being willing to say, that's not so good over here. We don't really have this, really environment of transparency or trust. So what can I do to build it? What are some things I can do? I can borrow. And my advice is always to reach out to other people, because again, like I said a minute ago, somebody has those answers, and all you have to do is pick up the phone or contact a university or contact somebody you saw on a TV show if you want, and learn from them. I mean, those CEOs that I give them all my deep appreciation that they helped share their knowledge, which I could pass on to others, and hopefully those others who've read it will go, wow, that's an interesting insight. So it's lifting up the rug, looking underneath, always being curious about how we can make things better. So I think that's probably my only advice.
Awesome. Well, Denise, thank you so much for spending the time with us, and for the research that you do and sharing it with the world, and sharing it with our podcast listeners. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kelly. I really had a blast. I hope it works out well.
Thanks so much.
This podcast was brought to you by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com. Thanks for tuning in to Permission to Speak. If you want to increase collaboration and innovation in your organization, check out more resources available at speakingpractically.com, or give me a call, Kelly Vandever, at 770-597-1108.